First contact fiction, it has its own category on Amazon, and I think that these are some of the most compelling stories in science fiction and even in fantasy. In fantasy, like Game of Thrones, The Wheel of Time, it does have some elements of first contact. In the Game of Thrones, we have Daenerys in exile. She kind of makes contact with the Dothraki horse culture, which is pretty alien to her, and likewise, she is a medieval style princess, which is alien to them. In the Wheel of Time, of course, there's the Shan-Shan, and they enslave magic wielding people rather than having magic wielding people rule them. And that is a clash of cultures as well. It's very compelling. And, I could go on. In a lot of sci-fi, there's some great first contact stories. One of my favorites is A Fire Upon the Deep by Vernor Vinge. And that is kind of humans making contact with aliens that look like dogs, but they're actually a hive mind where a pack of dogs is one person, and they are able to kind of telepathically hold themselves together. It's just an interesting way of having a society, and it's really cool. I think another extremely popular example in sci-fi is Project Hail Mary by the author Andy Weir. I know they're making a movie about it now, and that's really one of those extremely simple, high concept ideas where it's basically two characters. There's a human on a spaceship who's been kind of stranded, and then an alien who's also been stranded, and they make contact with each other, and it's kind of an exploration not only of the technology, but of their very different biological needs and that sort of thing. It's interesting. And then jumping back to fantasy, people of a certain generation might have read Clan of the Cave Bear by Jean Auel, and that also got a movie adaptation a long time ago. Basically, it's an exploration of primitive Neolithic human culture meeting Neanderthals for the first time. The main character is a human that gets adopted and raised by Neanderthals, and so she knows she's different. She doesn't really understand why she thinks and acts a little differently than the tribe that she's in, and it's an interesting exploration of that, the differences in the way her mind works and so forth. And jumping back to sci-fi, another one of the kind of weird standout ones to me is Infected by Scott Sigler, where there's an alien entity infecting the body of a football player, an ex-football player, and this guy has anger management issues, and the alien's invading his body. He's just pissed off at them. It's kind of like a proactive version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where this guy is trying to figure out what is going on, what these aliens are trying to do, why they're taking over his body. And they're kind of the harbingers of a much larger invasion, so the series, it's a trilogy, it grows in scope from there. It's an interesting trilogy. I could go on and mention some of the other big popular ones that most people know. There's Contact, The Three-Body Problem, Blindsight. But what I'm really here to talk about is why these stories are so compelling and the overlap with history. So I also read a lot of historical nonfiction, and there's all kinds of interesting stories. Now, one of the biggest period of history that I'm attracted to or drawn to as a reader is the Age of Conquest, otherwise known as the Age of Discovery. It's sort of like when the old world meets the new world, conquistadors. So it's interesting how in a lot of fantasy and science fiction, the clash of cultures oftentimes tends to be equal or gentle. I think in our world, it was often pretty brutal. Even in more gentle, like recent modern encounters, like in the modern era, most of the world has been contacted, but there are still a few uncontacted tribes, or supposedly uncontacted tribes. In reality, a lot of these tribes have been contacted in some way. And I read this book recently called Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, and it was about a guy that was a missionary who went to an Amazon tribe, and he kind of ended up losing his faith, and the tribe sort of converted him. And it's an interesting book, and it took place in, I think, the 1980s or 1990s, so it's a lot more of a recent first contact. But even there, pretty brutal. The gulf of understanding between this, like, PhD linguist and this tribe of people that, almost never have nothing to do with technology, don't really read or write. It's just like, it's night and day. It's a meeting of two very, very, very different mindsets. And I thought the book did an interesting job of capturing that, although he really did focus on the linguistic aspect. And the linguistic differences, but the cultural differences were there, buried in the subtext of the book. We could even say that the differences in mindsets between modern cultures, bipartisanship, like even that, the clashes between religion and politics and all that, in some ways those are like alien worlds meeting. Now, they're not quite as extreme as when you have an actual alien clash or uncontacted peoples meeting each other for the first time, but I think because we have so much kind of polarization in our world and strife, it's compelling to me to study the interaction between people that are coming from extremely different viewpoints, not just viewpoints, but cultural norms, cultural values, levels of technology. I actually explore that quite a lot in my published series, which is the Torth series, starts with Majority, and I'm exploring it again in my new series that I'm writing. Moving on to a particular period in history, the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish Empire, more or less. That's where I find it's just extremely compelling because you had clashes of millions of people, gigantic armies, and I'd say in a period of invasive exploration that is kind of unprecedented, I think, in human history before and after. There's a few books I'd recommend on this subject, the ones that kind of influenced me. I'll link to them down in the show notes. I would mention Night of Sorrows by Francis Sherwood. It's actually historical fiction, not nonfiction, but very heavily researched, and it's about the conquest of the Aztecs from the point of view of the woman that was translating for Cortez, and it's a really interesting look at that whole period. And then I'll also mention The Last of the Incas by Kim McQuarrie, and that was a nonfiction book that just blew my mind. Very exciting to read. It's one of those things where I think Hollywood doesn't quite dare to adapt something like that. It's just too bloody and too close to home and too real. But yeah, if you want to like find history exciting, I think that's the book. I think one of the most compelling and interesting aspects of conquests and first contacts that lead to conquest, it's the people who are caught between both worlds, the children of both sides, or people that have sympathies to one side but are from the other side. Those are the people that I think that's just extremely interesting. That's kind of the main character in my Torth series, and also it will be the main character in my new one. So for instance, the Inca conquest, to me, the Pizarro brothers who were conquering the Incas, they're not as compelling to me as Manco Inca, who was a guy that was raised by Spaniards, but he was kind of the last of the Inca emperors. And his rebellion, to me, that character is extremely compelling because you could see that the fact that he had the technological benefits that the conquistadors had, yet his sympathies were wholly with the Incas, of course. It kind of led to an extremely long rebellion that outlasted his life. And the culture was subsumed into what became, or the different cultures of South America, more or less, but the guy held out for a long time, and his followers did as well, and I think, to me, that's a really compelling story right there. In the case of the conquest of the Aztecs, to me, okay, Cortez is a totally crazy guy, crazy conquistador, so there's a little bit of, that's compelling to some degree, but he's also kind of ruthless and evil in a lot of ways. His translator is a more compelling character, just extremely, because it's you can see why she throws in with him. She doesn't want to be one of the virgins who gets sacrificed on a pyramid and thrown down the steps. So she throws in with Cortez, and that is completely understandable. She has no love for the Aztecs either. They are, they're the rulers of her people, and they've enslaved a lot of them, or subjugated them in terrible ways, and so she wants to get rid of them as much as anyone, but is the price too high? And you can see, as she gets to know Cortez and the conquerors better, it's ooh, Another one was, I think, River of Darkness by Buddy Levy, and I read that a while ago, and it was about some conquistadors cruising down the Amazon River looking for El Dorado. And just kind of as a side note in this book, one of these conquistadors went rogue and ended up joining one of the tribes, marrying a woman there, and the next time anyone saw him, he had gone native, so to speak, and he had all the piercings and tattoos, and he had kids, and he liked his life, and he was able to act as a translator for that tribe and get them benefits that other tribes were not able to get. So again, like, people who are walking in both worlds, to me, those are just so compelling as a storyteller. And I'd love to see more stories like that, of course. I think it's also worth exploring the incentives that drove the conquistadors and that would drive many conquerors of new lands. You know, on the one hand, it's like, you can say, like, oh, these people were ruthless pillagers, and they were pretty terrible. I mean, enslaving people brutally in many cases. But it's like, if you read into this, it's like, it's interesting. A lot of the conquistadors were basically poverty-stricken, illiterate, and they had no social mobility upward in Spain, where they came from. So, to them, the only path upward was to go to another country, pretend that they were trying to convert people to Catholicism, and when the indigenous people refused because they didn't understand the language, the conquistador would say, well, I gave it my best shot. I now own this land and I claim it for the crown. Send a letter back to the king and queen of Spain, and they'd get a title and riches, basically. Things they couldn't get in Spain. So it was, I mean, it was a gold rush in a lot of ways. And you can see parallels of that in the American expansion to the West and in many other periods of history. But to me, that's also compelling. It makes for interesting characters. They're driven by, in a lot of cases, greed, a lot of cases, desperation. They were people that felt like they really wanted more out of their lives and they couldn't get it any other way. Now, not to sympathize with horrific acts of cruelty and barbarous violence, because that was all there. But the interesting characters are the ones that said no to the barbarism and violence and went there trying to make peace or to settle down there in a peaceful way. They had to tread very carefully between their compatriots from their own land of origin, many of whom were putting immense pressure on them and on each other to just kill, enslave, and pillage as much as possible. It was like a big loot grab. If they wanted to settle in this place long term, if they saw it as a paradise, they wanted to make it a nice place to live. And that's pretty hard to do if you're just enslaving and ruining tons of people's lives. So I do think there were people that were torn between both of those motives and struggling. There were people that weren't completely awful, ruthless barbarians, but were pressured into it or became famous for trying to make some sort of peace, and usually getting criticized a lot for it, dying poor and all that. And I think because a lot of the conquistadors knew what they were doing was awful, they made a point of dehumanizing the people they were conquering and enslaving. We had a technological imbalance, and instead of just saying something along those lines, they're like, oh, no, these people are subhuman, they're, whatever the problem was. And they would purposely disassociate from the natives. So they wouldn't learn their language, they wouldn't learn their culture. They made a very strong point of not doing so because they didn't want to lose the loyalty of their men, they didn't want to be seen as sympathetic. They didn't want to take time away from their goal, which was often gaining land, gaining permission from the crown to rule, or gold. I have echoes of that in my series with the Torth, where the conquerors, the Torth, don't speak out loud. And they consider out loud speech to be what slaves do. And so that right there, they're all speaking in their minds, neural linked they're just linked together. And anyone else doesn't know what they're really saying or what they're really thinking. And so they're basically, the slaves and the Torth are speaking two different languages. And there's almost no correlation. The Torth know what the slaves are thinking because technological advantage there. And by the way, the Torth gained almost all of their technological advantages by conquest. So it's one of those things, once the ball gets rolling, if you're able to conquer one thing, you get more power, then you can conquer more. And I think that is how it worked with the Spanish conquest as well. And then coming from the other side of things, the natives, to them, the Spanish are going to seem very weird and mysterious. There's not that many of them, so you don't encounter them so often, and they're very just basically alien, and that makes them more frightening. And I have that as well going on in my Torth series. To the people being conquered by the Torth basically seem like very, very threatening alien figures. One final thought is that a lot of people on both sides of these conquests, especially the leaders, there's so much audacity. You've got to have a lot of audacity to say, I'm going to conquer that emperor over there and take all his stuff. But even coming from the other side, I was very surprised to learn that there was an Aztec princess who secured a dukedom for her children by marrying one of the conquistadors. So, that's pretty audacious as well. Even the figure of Christopher Columbus, who wasn't really a conquistador, but kind of started the whole thing in a lot of ways. I mean, that guy was audacious. He's sailing across the ocean 4 times and claiming all kinds of crazy things to the crown. Some of it was made up. And, just there's a lot of things this guy was doing that no one else was kind of crazy enough to do. He was known to be a nut. And it's just interesting to me that a lot of these people were full on just like, okay, I'm going to go to a land I've never seen before, into a jungle where I don't know how to survive, and I don't speak the language, and I'm going to just conquer everything in sight. Like, there's something really crazy going on in the minds of some of these people. And whether villain or hero, a lot of times with the conquistadors, it's villain. These are still very interesting and compelling characters. So I would encourage any author that writes about like clash of cultures and extreme disparities between wealth and technology, who wants to explore like people caught between two worlds. I find all these themes so compelling. I would definitely recommend that authors such as those read more nonfiction based during that time period. And of course, there's plenty of other examples throughout history. I'll jot down some book recommendations in the notes below, and hope you enjoyed.